to philosophy. Two. This is first lecture on Utilitarianism and Jeremy Bentham. I hope you enjoy it. Bye.
Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BCE. Jeremy Bentham and Immanuel Kant were both born in the 1700 CE. Why do introduction to philosophy courses so often skip from the time of the ancient Greeks to the early modern period? This is, at least in part, because of the immense influence that Plato and Aristotle had on Western philosophy for 2,000 years after they lived. Medieval philosophers, often working as Christian, Muslim, or Jewish scholars, returned again and again to the ideas of Plato and Aristotle as they tried to work out a philosophical basis for their religious beliefs. In fact, the influence of Aristotle was so strong during this period that he was referred to simply as the philosopher, so that those who studied at this time thought of philosophy as simply extending the ideas of Plato and Aristotle. As an upper division student at a university, you may have a chance to take a course on some of the fascinating ideas of the medieval philosophers and to see how they blended religious ideas of faith with those of Plato and Aristotle. But for the purposes appropriate to an introductory survey course, the next major movement of philosophical influence comes from the philosophies of Jeremy Bentham in England and Immanuel Kant in Germany. Bentham and Kant were alive and publishing their works at the same time. Although we could cover Kant before Bentham, he was born slightly earlier, we will be better equipped to understand Kant if we first cover the more straightforward theories of Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was born in London in 1748. Looking at Bentham from a modern perspective, it is clear that he was aware of moral issues that history has proven are of paramount importance. He advocated for such things as legal rights for women, laws against animal cruelty, the abolition of slavery, prison reform, decriminalizing sexual expression among consensual adults, and humane treatment of the insane. Today these ideas are mostly common sense for us, but Bentham lived in a time when slavery, repression of women, terrible conditions in insane asylums, and harsh punishment of sexual expression were the norm. These policies were often enforced with both legal and moral standards which justified that treatment. Bentham used his utilitarian philosophy to advocate for humane treatment of both humans and animals in a time when these views were not popular and could even be dangerous to his safety. Bentham gives his most influential account of his moral philosophy in a book entitled Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, sometimes referred to here below as IPML. This work was published in 1823 and offers the clearest account of his ethical views. Chapter 1 of the Principles of Morals and Legislations starts with this sentence: Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. This first sentence tells us volumes about the philosophical approach of Bentham. We know that pain and pleasure will be the key elements both of Bentham's psychology as well as his ethical theory. Bentham's psychology. Psychological egoistic hedonism. Psychological egoism is the view that humans, by nature, always act to serve their own best interest. When hedonism is added to this description, it makes a claim that humans always act to pursue their own pleasure. The only motivating forces for humans on this view are seeking after our own pleasures and seeking to avoid our own pains. Bentham believes that observation of human nature in ourselves and others is enough to show that psychological, egoistic humanism is true. If we look at our own behaviors and those of others, we will find that for every act we or others take, there is a pain that we are trying to avoid, or a pleasure we are trying to gain. And he claims that this reason will always explain human behavior. Is there a conflict between psychological egoism and being ethical? Do you think that psychological, egoistic hedonism is true? Do all of us act to pursue some pleasure or to avoid some pain? If this view is true, does it make ethics impossible? Can you see why someone might think that this view is incompatible with ethics? If human psychology is such that humans, by nature, will make all their decisions in order to avoid pain and seek after pleasure, then what point is there in asking human beings to be moral, or to look out for other people? It would seem that it would be impossible for us to do things for the sake of other people, or for the sake of ethics, if we do everything for the sake of our own pleasure and pain. In fact, Bentham believed that this psychological egoism is not in conflict with making choices to help others. He believed that we had good motivation, including the pleasure of social emotions, to help others and to act morally. The principle of utility. To be morally good is to pursue pleasure and to limit pain for everyone. Notice that Bentham gives both a psychological claim that we always pursue our own pleasure and the avoidance of pain, but also a moral claim that we ought to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. But Bentham does not believe that the goal of ethics is to pursue just my pleasure and the avoidance of pain. To maximize pleasure and pain in the world as a whole is my duty. This is what Bentham calls his principle of utility in the second section of chapter 1 in his introduction to the principles of morals and legislation. According to this principle, both specific laws and individual moral choices should be evaluated according to how they promote pleasure in the world and how they diminish pain. In the same way, actions and laws should be considered evil to the extent that they increase pain and limit happiness in the world as a whole. Though Bentham actually spends most of his book talking about how to establish good laws using the principle of utility, we will only be interested in the principle of utility insofar as it is a moral principle, evaluating individual acts according to the pain and pleasure they produce in the world. In chapter 17, section 2, Bentham puts the point clearly in this way. Ethics at large may be defined as the art of directing men's attention to the production of the greatest possible quantity of happiness on the part of those whose interest is in view. The only thing we can mean by good for society is good for the individuals in society. In section 4 of the first chapter of the Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, Bentham points out that the only thing we can mean when we say a law or behavior is good for society is that it is good for the individuals in that society. In section 4 of the first chapter of the Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, Bentham points out that the only thing we can mean when we say a law or behavior is good for society is that it is good for the individuals in that society. And what everyone within society finds to be good is having pleasure and avoiding pain. Why does Bentham believe that the principle of utility is the correct moral rule? Bentham tries to defend the idea that maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain is the foundation for all of morality. He starts defending his claim in Chapter 1, Section 9, by simply saying that everyone already agrees with it. It cannot be directly proven, because proof must end somewhere, and this principle is the foundation for his entire system, and hence cannot be proven by it. He believes that if we are honest and aware, we will realize that having pleasure and avoiding pain is what we all value, and the motivation for all our acts. He suggests that we could only argue against the principle by using the principle itself, and that no other principle can be found to anchor morality to its place. Contrasting Aristotle and Bentham on pleasure and intellectual pursuits. Hopefully you have noticed that Bentham's account of morality so far has something in common with what we saw at the beginning of Aristotle's Ethics. Hopefully you can also see some ways in which his approach is different. You remember that Aristotle, like Bentham, said that we should strive for happiness, but we remember that for Aristotle, happiness was a matter of maximizing my potential as a rational creature, and so a life of pleasure is not the same as the happy or fulfilled life. You will notice that Bentham has no trouble using the words pleasure and happiness interchangeably. For Bentham, happiness is just a form of human pleasure, but he is against the idea that happiness has to be intellectual to have moral worth. For him, the simple pleasures are just as valuable and meaningful as the intellectual ones. In his famous essay called The Rationale of Rewards from 1773, Bentham argued that high intellectual pleasures, such as poetry, might even be less valuable than simple games like pushpin, or think of the iPhone game Candy Crush for a contemporary comparison. His reason for thinking this is that pushpin, or Candy Crush, provides reliable pleasure that everyone can enjoy, while poetry can only be enjoyed by a few. Contrasting Aristotle and Bentham on pursuing my happiness. There is another important contrast in the ethical views of happiness of Aristotle and Bentham. You remember that for Aristotle, the main goal of life was to pursue my pleasure, fulfillment, enlightenment, and virtue. Aristotle believed that we need friends in order to pursue the good life, but my life is to be evaluated by my character, and I pursue my own flourishing. Bentham believes that people generally pursue their own pleasure, but he is very explicit that the morality of our acts is to be evaluated insofar as they create happiness in the world as a whole, and not just according to my own happiness. In this way, the emphasis of Bentham and Aristotle is quite different. The position of animals in ethics. The emphasis on happiness as the experience of pleasure that is free from pain brings out another important contrast between Aristotle and Bentham. Aristotle had little to say about the ethical status of animals, because for him, animals were on a lower plane than humans because they lacked rationality, the defining characteristic of human beings. But if pleasure and pain is the measure of ethical value for Bentham, then he cannot have this same view, and he does not. Bentham advocated for animal welfare and for laws against animal cruelty at a time when this was not a common idea. Bentham was not against eating animals. Can you guess why? Eating animals does not, in itself, cause pain. A painless death to become a meal might even mean that the animal avoids a more painful death than it might otherwise suffer if it died in the wild. But he did believe that we should be morally evaluated according to the amount of pain and discomfort that we allow the animals to endure while they are being raised for food and when they are slaughtered. As Bentham puts it in Chapter 17, Section 122, "Are there any reasons why we should not be suffered to torment them?" meaning the animals. Yes, several. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? A confusion in Bentham's principle of utility. Bentham is not always consistent in the way he describes the principle of utility. In one place, in the introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, Bentham describes the principle of utility this way. An action, then, may be said to be conformable to the principle of utility, or for shortness' sake, to utility, meaning with respect to the community at large, when the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than any it has to diminish it. Chapter 1, Section 6. Can you see how this formula of the principle of utility is different from the principle we have been discussing so far? Initially, Bentham said that the principle of utility implied that we should choose the actions that maximize pleasure and minimize pain and suffering in the world. In this paragraph, Bentham sets the bar lower and says simply that an act is right if it causes more pain than suffering in the world. Because this is inconsistent with the way Bentham usually discusses the principle, this is not the way we will discuss the principle of utility for this class. I bring up the issue here only to make sure that you don't confuse the utilitarian requirement as simply a requirement to do actions that cause more pleasures than pains. Instead, the utilitarian urges us to choose the actions that, of all the other actions I might choose, minimizes pain and maximizes pleasure in the world as a whole. Why does it matter if we maximize pain and minimize suffering, or just work to produce more pleasure than pain? Imagine this scenario. A student failed the class, and a teacher must decide to either hold the student back 1 year or to push them forward, knowing that they will not be ready and will likely fail the next year. What is the right act for the teacher if she is a utilitarian? If we understand the principle of utility to mean that an act is good if it causes more pleasure than pain, then probably no act will be acceptable. Either choice will have mostly painful consequences because this is a bad situation. The only duty it makes sense to impose on the teacher is that she choose the act which, among the acts available to her, has the least suffering. We cannot expect the pleasure of either choice to outweigh the pain. Bentham has also said, and will say later as well, that each increase in pain makes an act worse, and each increase in pleasure makes an act better. If this is true, then we know that if two acts both cause mainly pleasure, the act that causes the most pleasure will be the right one to choose, because it has more moral value. This aspect of Bentham's ethics is made clear in this statement from Chapter 17 of the Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, already quoted above. Ethics at large may be defined the art of directing men's actions to the production of the greatest possible quantity of happiness on the part of those whose interest is in view. Here Bentham is clear that morality is a matter of producing the greatest possible quantity of happiness, and not just producing more happiness than suffering with any particular action. How do I figure how much pain and pleasure is caused by my actions? Perhaps you are wondering how Bentham believes that we should go about figuring out how much pain and pleasure is caused in the world as a whole by our individual actions. Bentham knows that we will have to estimate this, but he goes into detail telling us how we can take account of pains and pleasures and compare the ethical importance of particular pains and pleasures. The prolific calculus, as he calls it, will be the topic of our next lecture.
This is the end of Lecture 1 on Jeremy Bentham and Utilitarianism. Goodbye.